We're very happy to welcome back our former research scholar, Title VIII research scholar, Elton Skendai. Just to give you a little background, he holds a PhD in government from Cornell University and was most recently the visiting fellow at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame. He's taught at various universities in the United States and in Albania, and he's been a trainer with international organizations, including the United Nations and the U.S. Institute for Peace. Previously, he developed and implemented a peace education joint project with the UN Department of Disarmament Affairs and the Hague Appeal for Peace. He's also got a book manuscript that examines the role of international actors in building effective state bureaucracies and democratic institutions in post-war societies. His current project is funded by is with the Norwegian Research Institute and investigates anti-corruption reforms in the Western Balkans. And I guess that's the data that you will be presenting to us today. He's also consulting with USAID and working in an article on how international organizations learn to improve their effectiveness in the areas of rule of law, democratization, and peace building. So today he'll talk about legal culture and anti-corruption reform, preliminary findings of his national research. So welcome back.
Thank you. So I'll stand up. It's great to be back at the Wilson Center. It's great to see some of the familiar faces. And so this is I'm going to present today on my on the new research project. Well, we call it new. It's been going on for the past 2 years, but finally we have some data that we can present. So today I will talk about legal culture and anti-corruption reform, and we'll focus on the research has focused on Kosovo, Serbia, and Macedonia, and we're still finalizing the elite interview data, but we have the bulk of the data from national surveys and focus groups. So, and the current the current elite interviews that I have at hand confirm the preliminary findings. So I'm confident that these findings are going to stand. So the questions that I want to explore today is first, how effective are anti-corruption reforms? And I want to have a show of hands here. Who thinks anti-corruption reforms are effective? Okay, great. So there's a room. Who thinks that they are sometimes effective? Okay. Who thinks that they are never effective? Okay. All right. So I think we have a group of realists here. Which is good. This is the camp where I stand. But it's actually a camp where when I started the project, I didn't stand in this camp. I thought more. The research that I had done basically indicated that a lot of the anti-corruption reforms, awareness raising, the legal reforms, etc., didn't seem to be effective because all the various indicators about corruption, etc., seemed, corruption still is very present, if not increasing. However, and the literature is divided. There is the pessimists who think, it can never be effective because we're transferring laws that are made in Europe, Western Europe, to contexts that that do not to cultures that do not fit, and they are seen as, because the laws are seen as illegitimate to the culture. The anti-corruption reforms are not going to be successful. And one point that I will keep making in this presentation, I have data support, is that these international laws are seen as very legitimate by both locals and elites. The second one is, the optimists, there's very few optimists who think that they work all the time, but there's the realists who basically think sometimes they work and sometimes they don't, and it depends on various kind of, conditions. The second question that we're going to explore is, do minorities behave differently from majorities in their observation of the law? And this is also an important question because previous research indicates that because minorities often are disadvantaged, when they meet a police officer, a government official, etc., they try to overcompensate by either using more context or actually bribing or engaging in illegal acts. So why is this important? Legal transfers are important for European Union integration. It's the whole European Union process functions through the transfer of a whole set of laws, acquis communautaire. So there's assumption that over time you will have legal harmonization and as well as normative, legal culture harmonization. And when we talk about definition of legal culture, I'm borrowing from Nelken here. It's a way of describing stable patterns of legally oriented social behavior and attitudes. How are people oriented toward the law? And legal transfers are important because we're referring to the legal transfer of laws, institutional structures, best practices. And in the context of EU integration, of course, the laws are around free markets, democracy, rule of law, and anti-corruption. So there is in the past decade, all of these countries have enacted new laws that criminalize corruption. So and finally, it's important in terms of the legal transfer to also notice that the European Union also pushes for protection of minority rights, and that's also part of the transfer. So the methods, we've relied on focus groups, 6 focus groups in 3 countries, national representative surveys, and booster samples. What it means is that in each country, in Kosovo, Serbia, and Macedonia, we've had a main sample from majority population, and then between 200 and 400 respondents from the minority population. And they were booster samples because we tried to oversample minorities, because if we relied only on a main sample of everybody, there would be very few respondents from minority population, especially, for example, in the southern Serbia, Preševo, Bujanovac area, where there's around 65,000 Albanian speakers there. So, and then we had structured, open-ended interviews, 150 at 3 countries. We're still, I think we now have around 30 that have been completed and translated. But the focus groups on the national and the survey data are here. And finally, we have interviews with religious leaders and anti-corruption experts. Now I'm going to move to how corruption is understood by ordinary people in Western Balkans. And there's different ways on, how to view corruption. A narrow definition would be focusing more on the exchange of bribes. A more wider definition would include a lot more, would include conflict of interest and, state capture, etc. Well, it seems what comes clear from the data is that the ordinary people think that corruption is bribery. Almost across, across the different countries, including minorities, citizens are really annoyed with the fact that they are often forced to give bribes, or they have to give bribes to get services in health, or they're forced to give bribes to police officers, etc. So, and that's the main concern. And of course, and it makes sense because most citizens actually have, when they interact with the state officials, they usually interact with lower level state officials. They don't interact as much with the higher level state officials. But so what's interesting is that nepotism is not, here I just borrowed liberally a cartoon from the New Yorker, which said, and if nepotism exists, my brothers will root it out. so nepotism does not come up as a very strong element of corruption, even though if the focus group data and the elite data often indicate about how hard, I mean, part of the problem about how hard it is to find a job and kind of, build a business without the proper contacts, whether they are personal contacts with the politicians or political contacts, etc. So nepotism does not come out as the crucial element of corruption. Bribery is, though. So who are considered important actors in the anti-corruption reforms? And here we have to understand that there's a variety of actors that have been involved in anti-corruption reform processes. We can see that in the 90s, the big emphasis was on raising awareness among the population that corruption was bad and we shouldn't give bribes, etc. So, and that here there was a strong emphasis on encouraging civil society. In the past decade, the emphasis has been more on inserting laws in criminalizing corruption, etc., and creating institutional structures, anti-corruption agencies and other bodies that target directly corruption. But so, and you have a variety, and often the anti-corruption reform is often funded from abroad. We could presumably we had in our questionnaire, in our survey, we had a long list of actors which could be considered important. And again, across the different countries, the key important actor was the government. Everybody thought that it was the government who had to enforce and implement. When I say implement the laws enforcing the laws that penalize corruption. So the focus groups also, and I will give a few quotes later on, even though people are very skeptical that the government is doing it, they're very cynical that the government is often not penalizing corruption, they still think it's the most important actor. International actors, they're again not seen across the board. They're not seen as crucial actors, but they're seen as positive actors. They think, yeah, they're welcomed. Yeah, we welcome their their push. And I have later on a graph, a chart to kind of illustrate that. The sad finding is actually that NGOs are not at all considered actors, important actors in how they in the anti-corruption reform. And this is important because if we look at Romania, for instance, and you look at kind of how anti-corruption drives led by Romanian NGOs managed to increase transparency in the parliament by basically publishing information about who was corrupt and who was not before the elections. There is, and we know theoretically that civil society could have a strong role in pushing for such changes. The only way to interpret this finding would be to say that various scholars, including Professor Lampi here in his recent book, actually concur that civil society is very weak in the Balkans. It's often donor-driven, doesn't have strong roots, and therefore it's the weakness of the civil society that prevents its engagement, and it's not that civil society does not have a role to play. Now, how effective are anti-corruption reforms? So there's different ways on how to view this. If we want to look at the macro level, at first sight it might seem that probably not very effective because bribery has increased. More than 60% of the respondents in each in each state viewed the bribery, said that the bribery has increased. So if the bribery has increased and, and corruption is bribery, then there is a huge problem with the drive for anti-corruption. However, most respondents, again, 60, 70, etc., across the board think that anti-corruption reforms efforts are helpful. They're still welcomed. They are annoyed that they're not implemented correctly, but they are helpful. The way that, and here is a bit about how they view the law. People view the law positively. Ordinary people think that the law is there to protect them. However, they think that the implementation by elites and the government is the problem because because the elite and the government actually often does not implement the law, and they act with impunity, and nothing happens to them. The ordinary people, they find themselves that if they make smaller mistakes, they are unprotected, or they're often asked to pay bribes. But the problem, they don't see the law itself as negative. They see the implementation. And legal culture is understood in terms of what it's lacked. When people are asked about what legal culture is, they think rule of law. They think respect for the law. They think kind of this how, and the focus groups kept referring back to Western Europe. A lot of them kept referring back to Switzerland, Germany. This is how we want ourselves to be, etc. However, in terms of the legal culture, what happens in the way laws are obeyed or disobeyed, again, people think that elites are more likely to disobey the laws than ordinary people, and there is impunity for that. But then the ordinary people say, since the elites are doing it and everybody else is doing it, if I don't do it, then I'm even more disadvantaged. So the ordinary people disobey the laws as well. Is government capable of change? So if the government is the most important actor, what are the answers that people give about how if the government is capable of change? Actually, a lot of the answers, I've just sampled a few here, a lot of the answers say that the government is capable of change. Yeah, the administration, the court officials know the laws. However, they don't implement them. It's not in their interest often to implement them. So this is one quote from a focus group. I think they're not capable of putting general interest in front of personal interest. Too much engagement for minimal benefit. It comes down to that here. Anti-corruption measures are not carried out because of petty interest, and that's my impression. And another one says, absolutely not. They get rich until they finish their mandate and then they leave. Very cynical. And then another one is saying, they are capable to solve the corruption. They aren't stupid. Only it won't suit them. They can, but they don't want to. Actually, the third one was the most common answer in the focus groups. The next part is, impunity. People were survey respondents across the board and focus group had they felt very strongly about the impunity. They felt that too many people were getting away with corruption. And as you can see in this, which come closer to your view in our country, would it be better? It would be better generally to have harsher penalties for lawbreakers or more lenient penalties for lawbreakers. As you can see, the difference is, the ones who think harsher penalties is 94% in Kosovo, 76% in Macedonia, 91% in Serbia. There's very few who think that there need to be more lenient penalties for lawbreakers. Are outside transfers illegitimate? We ask this question because, again, there is some scholars and practitioners who view the transfer of laws as problematic. And here we have the question, suppose the European Union puts some pressure on your country to reduce the level of crime and corruption. Would you welcome such pressure or feel insulted and resent such pressure? And again, the difference is 89% versus 8% in Kosovo, 83% versus 10% in Macedonia, 72% versus 9.4% in Serbia. So there's clear patterns out there that across the board that people think that such transfer are positive. However, they're often not implemented. Let's move now to the minorities and the observation of the law. Here, what's interesting is that we surveyed majorities and we surveyed minorities too. And again, there's in many ways we'd expect that they would have different views of the same kind of issue, and sometimes they do. So majority respondents tend to believe that actually the law often favors minorities. This was more clearly in Macedonia, where they thought that Albanian speakers in Macedonia were given preferential employment in state bureaucracy, despite fewer qualifications. But this was, majorities in Kosovo also claimed that in Serbia there was less of a concern, and partly because the minorities are much smaller there for the Albanians. So in terms of minority respondents, they actually believe, no, the law does not favor them. They think that the law protects them, protects their rights. And the focus groups also make clear that they view the affirmative action in employment as a way for rectifying previous legacies of discrimination and education, lack of inclusion in education, etc. Another question that we asked was whether minorities, ethnic and religious minorities, which in all these countries actually match, in the sense that Albanians in Macedonia are both ethnic minority, but also because they're Muslim, they're also a religious minority, and they're the one and the same for that. But so are the minorities disadvantaged compared to other people in our country? That's another question that we asked. And again, what's interesting is that the minorities think that are more likely to say that they are disadvantaged when they interact with government officials, police, courts, and political institutions. A lot of people, the majority of respondents tend to think that they are equally or much less likely to be disadvantaged. And very similar again with the question, do you think that minorities compensate for their minority status by using contacts and informal networks more often than other citizens? And again, 58% of Kosovo Albanians think so, but 39% of Kosovo Serbs do that. In Serbia, we had 49% of the main sample. The Serb respondents say that versus 40% of the Albanians, and similar here with in Macedonia. The next question is tries to actually ask for behaviors. So have you ever been asked to give a bribe to somebody? Have you ever been forced to give a bribe to someone? Have you ever voluntarily offered to give a bribe to someone? Have you ever voluntarily given a bribe to someone? And finally, have you ever acted as a contact for someone? We try to map the different and here actually there is some support for the catching up hypothesis. So minorities, so let's see, Albania and Macedonia, are more likely to say that they have been asked to give a bribe, forced to give a bribe, voluntarily often to give a bribe, and voluntarily given a bribe to someone. than the majority. So it's like, so for being asked to give a bribe is 37% versus 25%. The same thing holds in Kosovo. What's interesting is that this pattern does not hold in Serbia. So the minorities there are actually less likely to have been asked to give a bribe or to have acted. And it's hard. I'm still trying to interpret the finding. It has to do partly with the fact that the size of the minority is very small. In the focus groups, they actually say that they hardly know anybody outside their small towns. So when they go to Belgrade or Niš, they find themselves at loss. But the main issue that they have is actually high unemployment, and there actually they blame a lot nepotism among the local officials for who gets to be employed in the state bureaucracy and whose business gets to be to win tenders from the state bureaucracy. And again, it's very much like political and personal connections that matter. Now we move to another interesting finding which connects to my previous research, on state building. So the police is seen as significantly more effective in Kosovo than in Serbia and Macedonia. Across, the police are seen as more abiding than ordinary citizens, less willing to take bribes, can be trusted to ensure that laws are enforced, are capable of ensuring that the laws are enforced. There's more positive attitude to the police. Now, this is not saying that everybody thinks the police is perfect. All it's saying is that there's 80% of respondents in Kosovo think it's positive versus 30% of respondents in not perfect. The police is more abiding and less willing to take bribes versus 30% or 40% in Serbia and Macedonia. So, and this is puzzling also because the police in Kosovo is a very recent institution. It was only created in the past decade. And I would argue that there's some lessons here from the police reform that actually could carry out to anti-corruption reform as well. The police force in Kosovo was built under international administration through meritocratic recruitment and promotion. The OSCE and the European Union basically did not insulated this bureaucracy from political interference. So the politicians and the party leaders could not just put their own people into the police force. They had to, new recruits had to be vetted and pass rigorous tests in order to be accepted, mostly. And while there's still, while it's less so, there's been some positive developments, there's still politicization of police recruitment and promotion in Serbia and Macedonia, where it matters kind of, whom you know more than what you know. So the last part is I want to kind of challenge a bit the conventional understanding about how we think that if the laws or the transfers are legitimate, then they will lead to more positive outcomes. So the idea is legitimacy leads to effectiveness. And since the claim that various scholars make is that foreign laws or foreign reforms are often illegitimate precisely because they are foreign, and therefore they're not effective. I would say that what's more important is the reverse. Its legitimacy is more a byproduct of effectiveness, and it doesn't. If people see that the state bureaucracy is functioning well, etc., it's going to be more legitimate. Of course, there is some reverse causality, but that over time, if people do not find the institutions legitimate, they are less likely to kind of trust it, etc. But the focus groups, and the various interviews indicate that it's very easy to lose the trust of the population if you engage in kind of highly corrupt behavior, and then people just think that, they see that the wrong kind of people are getting wealthy and kind of there's impunity, and they don't trust the institutions. The implications for anti-corruption reform, first, I mean, the international legal transport, international laws are actually considered legitimate. It's, their implementation by local elites and administration that is questioned and is criticized. There is some evidence that supports the hypothesis, the argument that minorities do try to catch up. And finally, I mean, maybe we should try to think about deep structural reforms where we focus on civil service reform and kind of meritocratic recruitment and promotion within bureaucracies as a way to undermine corruption. It takes a longer time to do that, but however, I mean, if you build a professional bureaucracy that believes is their duty and have normative commitments to being public civil servants, then they are less likely to engage in both petty corruption, bribery, etc., and higher level one, nepotism and state capture. Thank you.
Okay, we'll open the floor to questions. Already many of them. We'll start with Andrew. Could you wait for the microphone to be brought to you? Right here. Thanks. And also introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Andrew Radin. I'm currently here at the Wilson Center, and I just finished my PhD, also on state building, partly on Bosnia. So I think this is very interesting research. It's a good place to look. I have a couple questions about. The first one is about sort of. It seems like a lot of the variation between countries can be explained by sort of broader political trends, right? It's not surprising that Kosovo generally has a better feeling about international transfers than Serbia, given the fact that Kosovo already has sort of, a warmer relationship with the European Union and the international community more broadly. So, is that, and I think that sort of thing could apply to a wider range of your findings. What do you think about that? A second is about sort of high-level versus low-level corruption. You talk about how people like the Kosovo police, but the police have been sort of less able to deal with sort of organized crime. Sort of very, Thaci's been accused of all this stuff. Minister of Transport, To what extent do people differentiate between these different types of corruption, and how does your survey sort of understand that problem? The third question that I was wondering about, sort of whether your survey can differentiate, is is the case that people think that corruption is bad and that we should try to be like Switzerland, or is it that the problem is that I'm not higher up on the corruption ladder? Is there a way of understanding that sort of point? And I think that might be an important type of sort of public conception to understand. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm going to take those and then we'll...
Sure, we can take a few more. I can answer.
Yeah, so Rob and John. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I'm Rob Benjamin with the National Democratic Institute. We have democracy programs in Central and Eastern Europe, including the countries covered in the survey. One or two general points, if I can. I was taken by Elton, by your comment initially about culture. I was in Kosovo 2 years ago. One of my staff colleagues said, "What surprises you the most about Kosovo?" And I said, sort of flippantly, the absence of respect for the public square. Public square being sort of a Western, even American notion about personal responsibility to protect, and participate in the public arena. And I said that surprised me because here you have, if you isolate out minorities, you have in Kosovo a very homogeneous, small population, yes, with social and political and regional fissures, but nevertheless, a little bit like Scandinavia, you've got a group of people that are very tight and clearly socially and otherwise respect and revel in their society, but in a very juxtaposed way, diss the public square by engaging in so much corruption. And so I didn't understand that as an outsider. The second point is...
The public square you refer to, just what do you mean by when you say the public square?
The public square being that legal culture, that affinity to protect public assets and participate in It's kind of going to your definition. It's kind of another phrase one might use. Okay, so that could be a cultural argument. You can also introduce, as you were hinting at, I think, an economic or structural one. The state is big. The state controls a lot of assets in economies that are extremely poor. And so people don't have alternatives to the state when it comes to job creation, when it comes to income, when it comes to social service provision. Is there a structural argument to be made that if you reduce the power of the state in the economy, particularly in developing a truly independent private sector, that you would have fewer instances and opportunities for state capture, fewer instances of corruption? Is there a correlation or not? Because we have to go back to the cultural argument. It doesn't matter if we're talking agency or actor, doesn't matter. You can create a private sector, you can have business-to-business relationships, you can have shareholders, you can have those assets that are found in a private sector that speak to profit motive, incentives, and other things that would suggest more appropriate behavior. So I'm wondering if there's been any research done on sort of economic transitions vis-a-vis corruption. And the final comment about the government. Of course, the government is more than one institution, as you were alluding, and the comment here is about democratization. There shouldn't be one government actor. The government shouldn't be monolith. Of course, we need to see separation of powers. We need to see competition among political factions which hold power in government. And secondly, of course, we need to see representation. And that goes to questions of election reform, electoral participation, legislative advocacy, the role of the media, et cetera. So there's a lot of unfinished business when we think about government, agency, and government, the reform of government understood as political and constitutional as it intersects with anti-corruption.
Thank you.
John Lampe, Wilson Center, University of Maryland. I don't think I'll have several questions, but those are all some good ones. And in response to a presentation in my own experience over the years, that to be able to identify from what you've presented, well, which side is he taking? Oh, can't do that. And so I wanted to appreciate the balance between the three sides that should add to the credibility of the project overall. And I also want to endorse the importance, as Leonard Cohen and I did in our volume, on reforming and staying with the reform of public administration. And we'd like the European Union and the acquis and the whole accession process to continue with the European Union in place to move that forward. But the one thing that you didn't mention, and our last speaker just did touch on it, which I wondered would have something to do in differentiating in the addressing of corruption, and that's the three medias in these places where I think, as wild and irresponsible as it can sometimes be, there is something like a free media exchange in Serbia that does not hesitate to focus on corruption of one kind or another, and certainly had something to do with a change of political administration and control in the most recent election, a change that we haven't seen in Kosovo. Thaci and the boys are still there, and Gruevski is in a continued strong position in Macedonia. I don't know, maybe hard to get at the media. Danas editor, Radomir Ličina, had tried to work on some appraising media responsibilities and openness around the region. I don't know if they even have the funds to continue that. But I wondered if you saw media as some area into which you might add some questions about how the respondents saw the media.
Excellent. Thank you.
Maybe that's enough for now.
I think that's
okay.
enough for now. Because I have...
Just one.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. So, Andrew, in terms of kind of the broader variation, the interesting thing, I mean, what surprised me actually is how often little variation was there, across majority populations. So, I mean, there's Serbia has been bombed in the in the late 90s, and still a lot. I mean, the majority of people viewed international legal transplants and international legal transport as positive. Okay, we can understand. I mean, the Albanians in Kosovo and Albania are some of the most pro-American and pro-European. They'll anyway say yes, yes, yes. But across, and the minorities too. Minorities in each of these countries also are very welcoming to international kind of laws. So what surprised me more was how little variation was there this time. There was more variation in how majority-minority relations were viewed from each side, in the sense that often majorities thought the minority was more corrupt and minorities thought, no, we're not more corrupt, we're just more disadvantaged, etc. But that's to be expected. In terms of the high level of corruption, where there's a lot. The focus groups in Kosovo, and less the interview data, kind of the focus groups in Kosovo have all expressed a lot of dismay about the high level of corruption and nepotism, etc. at the government and political level, and but to understand why they like the police is that people have. Ordinary people do not have less chance of meeting and looking at how the prime minister is giving a public procurement tender or not. But they're more likely to meet a police officer in the street and see how they relate if they ask for bribes, or if they're forced to give bribes, or if they're respected and treated So that's why, and since bribery is considered to be like the thing for corruption, a lot of people view the police as more effective. The police has not been, and it's recognized, has not been really effective in tackling high-level corruption. But it doesn't. But you have to understand in the context of the overall, very few. The prosecutors are not doing. Are not. Investigating that much. The anti-corruption agency in Kosovo looks at various cases of conflict of interest, etc. So you have to look at and even the internationals, EU mission, etc., has had huge trouble trying to tackle this thing because, in the end, the issue is if you try to tackle high-level corruption, these are the people. For both the courts, the prosecutors, and the EU mission, is that these are the people who you have to interact. These are the elected. This is the elected government. So it's very hard to undermine your partner right there. So so in the sense, police is. I would not say that the police is the main actor here, who would be the one who should be working against high level. It's one of the actors. They should be. So in terms of whether they do differentiate, the third part of the question was.
So is it the case that people are opposed to corruption generally, or they're opposed to the fact that they're opposed to the corruption check?
Yeah, they are. So the interesting. They say they're opposed to corruption generally, but then in the focus groups you hear a lot of, it's not a lot, but some comments, and this is across the board, which says yes, I'm opposed to corruption generally, but if I had to find a job, and there was no other way, of course I'll try to use contacts. I'm not stupid. Everybody else is doing it, so why don't I do it? So it's just so you have a classic collective action problem here, because if everybody believes that everybody else is going to do the same, then you're left out if you try to play an honest game. So, Rob, the question about culture. We asked questions about what kind of laws do they think were easily. They didn't mind about breaking, etc. And there were a lot of them were across the board. Traffic didn't rank high, as a way as a law that needed to be obeyed, etc. And but there is a general issue about respecting the public square, that actually has. I think it's not just the Western Balkan problem, but it's more of a post-communist problem. when the public was so monolithic and kind of, the state, less in Yugoslavia, but more in the other countries, but even in Yugoslavia, you had various ways of kind of, public enterprises that dominated people's lives, that there was a retreat more toward individualism, even in relatively homogeneous societies. In terms of, reducing the power of the state versus not, there's a huge debate in the literature about that. If you believe, the head of the economics department at Harvard, Alessio Malesina. So for him, it's like, in order to reduce corruption, you reduce the power and the size of the state. And there's some intuitive, we know that more competition, can reduce corruption. However, the issue is that if you see globally who are the least corrupt countries, they are the countries which have a huge size of state, like Scandinavian countries, Canada, etc., that have 40-50% taxation rate and strong kind of welfare states, etc. In terms of Kosovo, what I would actually argue that Kosovo needs to reduce the public administration size. It's very huge compared to kind of the economy. It's very huge compared to the rest. Any kind of indicator compared to the population, compared to the employment, etc. It's very huge across the Eastern Europe. So it's a big burden on taxpayers, and it doesn't produce as much. So there you'd have to. But in terms of the state, I think the state should still try to kind of, as it sheds some of its, size, it should still try to regulate. You still need laws, and you can borrow some of these laws to regulate. So it's not simply just kind of divest the state of all power, because then you have a weak state, and people actually want the state to be able to address impunity. They want the state to be addressing a lot. We had other questions that I didn't put here, but people actually want more legal controls rather than less, I think.
I can just say, I think maybe the correlation would be to compare public sector largesse between a country like Kosovo or the Western Balkans and Scandinavia as the opportunity for corruption rather than the ability of the state to exact anti-corruption policies to see that through.
Yes, so for example, if you see here, so almost everybody will prefer more legal controls on safety of work, quality of goods, etc., rather than less. So people actually expect the state to kind of have a strong regulatory. They just don't like the lack of implementation and the corruption. So, but I agreed with a lot of what you said, that that we know the literature says the better competition you have among the parties, the more independent actors, civil society, media, etc., are able to counteract the power of the government and create transparency and accountability, the less likely the officials are able to address to remain very corrupt. So I agree with you completely in that way. And part of the problem, in terms of the broad structural level in Western Balkans, is that you have basically often, the electoral competition is very hard to distinguish between policies. A lot of the votes are either based on clientelism or based on protest votes. You've had it for so long, I really hate how corrupt this is, I'm going to vote against you, etc. And in terms of the media, we did ask questions about media, Professor Lampi, and it was ranked very low. And I was surprised. Even in Serbia. In Serbia, what you had was the government was ranked first. I think it was 25%. And then the anti-corruption bodies were ranked second, and then everybody else was just like few percent. So, but I would be, and I'm not an expert. I don't have data on the independence of the media in Serbia. But it's very possible that you're right.
Sharon.
To follow up on John Lampe's question on the media and the role in reducing corruption, I was wondering if you've done any research on the role of foreign investors. I would say that if you look at the EU as a whole as a force in reducing corruption, I mean, there are so many variations from country to country within the EU. And I mean, if you look at the new member states, Estonia has the best rankings of any of them. And it's my understanding that it's because they have a lot of investment from Nordic countries. And like when it started coming in, they kind of changed the political culture and made people less tolerant of corruption. Whereas like sometimes even German investors have not had that impact in the region. So like Siemens was involved in some big corruption cases itself. And so, I mean, it's kind of an interesting point to look at. My other question is, I was hoping that you could say something about your choice of case studies. I thought it was a little unusual, maybe by omissions. And I don't know if you were just choosing countries that had significant minority populations, or like it would have been interesting to see some research on Bosnia or Montenegro or some other countries. So.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
Hi, my name's Nick Lisis. I work in USAID in the E3 Bureau. We renamed the Economic Growth Bureau into E3. I work on commercial legal reform and have worked in Macedonia and many other countries around the world. I was just curious that about a few things. I'm Greek by background, so I noticed that many of the problems that you mentioned about these three countries also pertain to Greece. Bloated public sector, not a lot of public trust, high levels of corruption, inability to reform, and yet Greece became a European Union member and part of the Eurozone, but who knows for how much longer. I'm curious whether these results that you see in the Western Balkans is, in your experience, does that apply to other developing countries around the world? Is this just unique to the Western Balkans? And I'm wondering about legal culture in an historical sense, and, could any of these things be like remnants of Ottoman legacy? I've read in passing some things that said that countries with an Ottoman past have low levels of public trust among individuals, which means that engaging in private sector activity is risky, and so I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
Any other questions? Maybe I'll ask a question too about civil society. That seems to be sort of the missing link. We know that NGOs exist. We know because USAID and the EU has funded so many of them, and there has been a lot of effort made in sort of building that sector. So maybe you asked questions of the respondents to explain why NGOs are not respected or ineffective, or and I know in neighboring countries like in Bulgaria, there was a big book to sort of expose NGOs as the actual actors of corruption, because they're getting external funding and so has any of that sort of spilled over? Is it just that they're not good at communicating? They're better at communicating with external funders than they are with local populations, or are there other factors involved?
Okay, thank you. Well, okay. Excellent. So the first question, foreign investors. Great questions. I don't have data. It's very... Yeah. I mean, there's some more. I mean, there's a little bit more in Serbia, but I mean, there's... so I don't know, the FDI flows are very weak across these countries. But what's interesting because I did my dissertation on Kosovo, and what was interesting there was how I thought the political elite use foreign investment versus how they use the local investors. So so when they would provide public procurement tenders for local investments, they would use their own kind of personal contacts, etc. Even people from the same small regions, from the same small village as they themselves were. So then there was probably a lot of kickbacks going around. But when they would interact with foreign investors, so I mean, Kosovo's roads, they're building roads, a lot of roads. So then they would give contracts to American companies. The big contract was given to an American company. And there was a perception, I mean, I don't have survey data for that, but I have some, some elite interviews for my previous project, that when they would give the internationals the contract, it was not because they needed, they would get kickbacks, monetary kickbacks, but they would get support. So the government would be like more likely, okay, I'm a friend of Americans, I'm stronger backing, so or the Europeans. So so there was that mechanism there. However, we did, I mean, first because there's a little foreign investment, and second, this was not included in our questions. I cannot give you any precise answer on that. In terms of choice of cases, and I think I'm going to connect these two questions. I mean, this study builds on previous studies that have been organized by, I mean, the main principal investigator, Åse Grudeland, she's Norwegian, has worked on, she did the same, I mean, she looked at legal culture, but less about corruption and anti-corruption reform, legal culture and minority-majority relations in Ukraine, Bulgaria, and the United Kingdom and Norway, just to create kind of some variation. And so, what this project brings new is the new focus on corruption and anti-corruption reform. The other projects viewed at how the people, viewed kind of legal culture, a little bit of corruption, etc., but was more broad about how people interacted with officials. So, and what we found there, that actually Ukraine and Bulgaria are very similar in terms of, various areas. So it's not simply, and Ukraine was not part of the Ottoman Empire. It was the borderlands up north. But the Bulgaria, there were similar issues, minority, majority. There were similar issues in terms of how they approached the law. But the reason why we chose these cases was that we wanted to see variation, to see whether there was such a thing as a legal culture, or was it the status as if you are a minority or a majority, would you behave differently? So what's interesting is that an Albanian in Macedonia actually has a slightly different relation to the law than an Albanian in Kosovo, precisely because they're a minority. And so it's not less about the legal culture, Albanian culture, etc., or Serbian culture, and it's often about where you stand in the society, how many whether are you politically equal or not. So we wanted to maximize that variation, and we had majority population in Kosovo, minority, and then we had minorities in Macedonia and Serbia, which we had between 20 and 25% of Macedonian citizens are Albanians, but a very small minority in Serbia. So we wanted to maximize it. And then in terms of, we would have wanted to enlarge it. However, it's very expensive to have this, huge surveys create. It's been. I didn't talk about the logistic about it, but it's we've spent a year just trying to deal with logistical problems about finding this issue. So there was also the amount of money and the logistics that we could put into the project that actually determined the relatively small size. But we still had little data. We didn't know much about how this transfers were viewed in Western Balkans. So it's still, I think, a contribution. It definitely seems similar to Greece, and I do think that European Union should be careful before just making a political statement and including. I would love for all three countries to be included. I'm from the region as well. I think it's great. The Europeanization has a positive impact, but they have to meet a certain criteria, because then once they're in, it's harder to change them, and it's they can create broader systematic problems. And civil society, yes, I was actually surprised. I know, having been part of wider networks of civil society in the Balkans, I know a lot of the people in each of these countries that are engaged in such activities. So it was sad for me to see, because a lot of them actually mean well and have tried to do good work, but their efforts were not recognized. I mean, and it does. I think there's two issues that are, I think need to be noted about civil society. First of all, the focus groups thought of them as important for raising awareness. However, people know already that there's corruption and it is a problem, and etc. So I don't know whether raising awareness is the way to kind of to implement anti-corruption reform. The second problem, structural problem, is that they're often, I mean, while they're not viewed, I have previous data, they're not viewed as very corrupt compared to the government and other kind of agencies. So it's less about that, but they're a lot more focused in the capital city. They're well networked to the internationals, etc. And as you're right, they know how to speak, the donor talk, and for a while there was like a global push to fund civil society because they viewed the state as the problem and they saw civil society as the solution. So, I mean, I don't think that the state is always the solution or the civil society is always I think you need some form of civil society to counterbalance the state. So in a way, I don't know, the solution for them, I think, would be to kind of broader participation, engage more in grassroots. I mean, in terms of the anti-corruption reform movement in Kosovo, which I know personally, they had an image problem because each government would say, "Oh, they're with the opposition." They would kind of put, blame, say that they're really supporting. I mean, they're politically affiliated. They're not independent actors who are trying to encourage accountability. And second, I mean, unfortunately, they were often called, if you criticize us, you're an enemy of the state. So that was a problem, in terms of how they're portrayed in the media as well. I don't think that the ordinary people view them as enemies of the state, but they probably don't view them as very effective. And it's also precisely because they see the corruption still going at the high level, especially. And the people, the civil society people themselves think that there is a problem. They need to, but they view it as we need to work more, not that we've been a failure, so it's just like let's give up, switch to private sector or kind of do something else. Okay.
Okay, well, I think we've reached the end of our time. Thank you for returning, and hopefully you'll return once again to update us on your research as it moves forward. So now please join me in thanking Elton for a great talk.